Hey guys, well here we go with the fourth and final video for chapter 22. It says section 5, but we're on video 4. Remember we skipped over section 4 dealing with the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the textbook. So don't get confused by that thinking that you missed a video somewhere in the way. It is section 5 in the textbook, but this is the fourth video. Regardless, it's the last thing that we're going to be covering in chapter 22. We're going to be talking about Russia, reform and reaction in Russia. So Russia had been struggling to keep up with the changes seen in Europe basically since the Renaissance, since the 14 and 1500s. And during the 1800s, many reformers decided that the time had come for change. Now, before we talk about the changes, let's first talk about the conditions in Russia by the time we're getting into the late 1800s. First thing to know about Russia is that it's big. It's the largest nation in the world. That was true in the 1800s and it's true today. Very, very large. It spans really the breadth of 2 continents. Russia sometimes gets broken down into different kind of regions. If you're looking over here, Western Russia is where you have most of your cities. That's where Moscow, St. Petersburg is. That's where most of the population lives. But you've got this huge, huge expanse all throughout here. Okay, and much of this is Siberia. Largely uninhabited because it is very, very cold, but it does go all the way over to the Pacific Ocean. Now, in the mid to late 1800s, even though it was behind the times a little bit, it was still counted among the world powers like Great Britain and Germany. Now, that being said, it wasn't fully reaching its potential. It has immense natural resources. As I said, it's a huge country, but it had failed to turn these resources into economic wealth in the industrial age. One of the things holding it back was the social structure. Russia's social structure was still pretty much the same that it had been in the Middle Ages. It was dominated by the wealthy landowners, and the rich, we're talking about landowners. We're talking about aristocracy, not rich businessmen the way that you were seeing emerge in places like Great Britain, Germany, and the United States by the late 1800s. And these rich landowners, they resisted any change that could threaten their power. And the majority of the population, the overwhelming majority of the population, were serfs. Move me out of the way. Serfs were laborers who were tied to the land. Remember learning about them in the Middle Ages from Global 9 last year. And they were really only a half a step up the social ladder from slaves. Serfdom in particular was holding Russia back. As long as peasants, workers, servants, as long as they were under the complete control of their masters, Russia's economy would always be backwards. Now, at the very top of the social structure and the Russian government was the Tsar. The Tsar was the Russian emperor, and he ruled with absolute authority, right? Even into the 1900s, the idea of divine right. You see kind of this, this is of Nicholas I. This is not in the Middle Ages. This is, Nicholas II. This would have been the last Tsar who ruled up until 1914. The idea that they rule by divine right, that they are God's chosen servant, that remained very, very strong in Russia up until into the 20th century. Some czars had made some very limited attempts at change, but it always took those changes back when it appeared like they would threaten the czar's control. The changes brought by the Enlightenment and the revolutions like the American and French revolutions that we discussed in previous chapters, they really had made no impact in Russia. You didn't have constitutional monarchies in Russia. These guys were strict, absolute rulers. However, one czar who actually did try to make some reforms was Alexander II. Now, Alexander came to power during the Crimean War. Let me move me out of the air so you can see the full map. The Crimean War was fought between Russia and the combined forces of Great Britain, France, and these guys down here, the Ottoman Empire. Okay, Crimea, you can see it up here. All right, that's a region to the north of the Black Sea. The Black Sea is really what the war is over here. And this area in particular, the Crimean Peninsula, it was about control of the Black Sea, right? Because the Black Sea is a very important naval trade route as you're going from Central Asia into the Mediterranean, right? You got to go through the Black Sea. That's why Istanbul, the capital of Turkey, if you go back hundreds of years, is Constantinople, why that was such an important trade site for centuries. So the Black Sea is very, very important for controlling that. And very embarrassingly for Russia, they lost. It really showed Russia's need to improve, especially in terms of industry and its economy. So Alexander decided to implement some major changes, the most important being the emancipation of the serfs. Emancipation means to free. This royal decree that freed the serfs from their land bondage, it seemed like a good idea, but it did very little to improve the conditions of the poor peasants. The freed serfs, they were too poor to just buy land land after they gained their freedom. They weren't going to be able to afford anything for themselves, and many ended up moving to the cities looking for work. Alexander also made several other changes, but the problem was that they failed to really go far enough. They didn't do enough to keep really either side happy. They angered the conservatives, and they didn't do enough to make the really more radical liberals happy. Radicals in particular felt he didn't go far enough, and they demanded more changes, and this made Alexander take a little more repressive stance of holding back on some of the progressive changes that he had taken early on. And in 1831, he was assassinated. A bomb went off under his carriage, and he was killed. So this in turn leads to his son, Alexander III, taking over. Now, Alexander was understandably furious over his father's death, and he blamed it on giving the people too much power. So he implemented a very harsh crackdown on freedoms. He increased the power of the secret police to spy on suspected traitors. He imposed strict censorship on newspapers and books, so no more freedom of speech. He also began a program called Russification. Now, this was aimed at making Russian the only acceptable culture in the Russian Empire. Now, you look at the Russian Empire, the ethnic groups. You've got Russians throughout here, and as I said, this is the heartland of Russia. You got Moscow, you've got your hard cities, but still, there are a lot of different ethnicities within this empire. You got Ukrainians, you got Belarusian, you have some Poles, because part of Poland was or what today would be Poland, was a part of the Russian Empire. You've got an awful lot of Central Asian people throughout here as well. Okay, so it's a very, very diverse empire with many different languages and even religions. So Alexander said, I want to make Russian the only language, and I want to make the Russian Orthodox Church the only religion. And this program of Russification in particular targeted Jews. All right, much of Russia's Jewish population lived in what today would be Poland and the Ukraine, and the Russian government forced them to relocate, and they encouraged pogroms. Pogroms are violent mob attacks on Jewish people, and they go back for centuries, but in this time they were actually sanctioned by the Russian government, right? They encouraged people to go out and do things like destroy Jewish homes and businesses, and in many cases actually murder Jews themselves. So this really harsh persecution of Jews then in turn led to many of them fleeing Russia, and a lot of them came to the United States. So Alexander III's reign was clearly not the nicest in terms of freedom, but one positive impact he had was on Russian industrialization. A big focus was on railroads, culminating in the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Now this linked Western Russia, as I said, with its major cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, with the East on the Pacific. So that was a pretty impressive industrial feat that he was able to do. But industrialization didn't come without problems. It was largely opposed by wealthy landowners. Remember, these were the guys who were at the top of the Russian social status for centuries, and they feared that they would lose their status at the top of this social pyramid if wealthy business owners, like were emerging in Great Britain and the United States, were to knock them off. Also, just like in Western Europe and the U.S., industrialization created a very large working class, and the very same type of thing that we talked about in previous chapters on the Industrial Revolution. They toiled in factories for really low pay, and they worked under lousy conditions. And the industrial slums in Russia mirrored those of Great Britain and Germany, with disease and poor living conditions. So all the same stuff that we talked about in previous chapters, now Russia is starting to experience. So discontent among the working class eventually gave to a rise in the support for socialism, right? The spreading the wealth, okay, where the workers and the people will own the means of production. And so, the writings of guys like Karl Marx begins to spread, and that's going to have very, very important consequences in later decades in Russia. Now, much of the discontent in Russia boiled over into an event known as Bloody Sunday. Now, first, a little backstory. 1904, Russia is involved in a war with Japan, and this is over the territory of Manchuria that you see here. Okay, here's the Japanese Empire. You notice it includes Korea at this point. Up here in purple, that's the Russian Empire. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about Japan and this area of Manchuria in later chapters, but just know that by 1900, Japan had industrialized and modernized their enemy. Russia had not, and this led to Russia's defeat. Now, their defeat by the hands of a non-European nation led to widespread humiliation and anger among the Russian people. They blamed the Tsar. Protests broke out throughout the country. Workers went on strike. People began calling for a new constitution. And this widespread discontent, it culminated in January of 1905 with a peaceful protest. A Russian Orthodox priest led a peaceful protest to the Tsar's Winter Palace. in St. Petersburg. And fearing, there were thousands of people that went, but they were chanting religious hymns and they were calling for the Tsar to come out, not to lynch him or anything like that, but just to talk to them. But the Tsar, fearing the protests, he sent soldiers outside the gates, and the soldiers eventually opened fire on the protesters. Casualties were in the hundreds, and this really scandalized the Tsar's administration, and the events of Bloody Sunday really had made the people lose faith in the Tsar. They no longer felt that he was capable of being the father of the country. Now, the Tsar would remain in power for another 12 years or so. He would try and implement some changes, but the people would not forget the events of Bloody Sunday, and we will talk more about these later changes that would come in Russia when we get to the chapter on World War I. All right, so that wraps things up for this section and for chapter 22.